The legal wall that protected Catherine of Aragon. Why Henry VIII dared to kill Anne Boleyn but never touched his first wife. Everyone thinks they know the story of Henry VIII and his wives. The brutal king who married 6 times. The tyrant who killed the ones who displeased him. The man who sent Anne Boleyn, the mother of Elizabeth I, to the scaffold, but let Catherine of Aragon, the woman he rejected, die in her bed. The myth goes like this. Henry spared Catherine because he still had a shred of decency, that deep down he respected her, that he couldn't bring himself to harm the woman who had once been his beloved queen. It's the comforting version of the story. It lets us imagine that even monsters have limits, that somewhere behind the crown and the axe there was still a heart that remembered the first wife who loved him. But what if that's not true? What if the real reason Henry VIII did not dare lay a hand on Catherine of Aragon was not love, not mercy, not guilt, but fear? Not fear of God. Not fear of his conscience. Fear of something colder. A legal wall and a political empire standing silently behind her. Because hidden right in front of us is a truth we rarely talk about. Catherine of Aragon built herself a shield so strong that even Henry the Tyrant could not break it. He killed Anne Boleyn in less than 3 years. He destroyed Cromwell, executed nobles, terrorized his own court, but he never once tried to execute Catherine, even when she openly defied him. That difference is not an accident. It wasn't softness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a calculation on both sides. Why? What made this one woman untouchable in a kingdom where queens were disposable? Today, on Hidden Crowns, we're going to tear down the myth of the helpless, crushed Catherine and uncover the strategy that made her the most dangerous woman Henry ever faced. We'll see how an abandoned wife turned Henry's own divorce arguments against him, how an exiled queen used international law as armor, and how an aging Spanish princess forced the King of England to back down without lifting a single sword. And by the end of this story, you may realize that Henry VIII didn't spare Catherine out of kindness. He spared her because to touch her would have been suicide. Before we begin, remember to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns so we can keep digging up the stories history tried very hard to bury. Let's start with the Catherine people think they know. The sad, abandoned wife. The woman who prayed while Henry chased younger women. The tragic queen who refused to give him a son. It's an image that fits neatly into the narrative. The loyal first wife replaced by the glamorous mistress. The devout Catholic crushed beneath the wheels of the Reformation. But that is only half the story. Before she was Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon was something far more important. She was Infanta of Spain, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the monarchs who finished the Reconquista, funded Columbus, and built the first global empire in Europe. Catherine was born into power. Her childhood dinner table was surrounded by ambassadors and war plans. She spoke Latin, understood politics, and knew exactly what it meant to be a royal pawn on a European chessboard. From the cradle, she knew the world was not kind to daughters, but she also knew that daughters could move kingdoms if they were placed on the right square. And she wasn't just Spanish royalty. Through her mother's bloodline, she was the aunt of Charles V, the man who would become Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, ruler of the Low Countries, and effectively the most powerful sovereign in Europe. Put simply, Catherine of Aragon was not just Henry's wife. She was Europe's niece. You don't just get rid of a woman like that without consequences. You can cast her aside emotionally, strip her of titles, separate her from her child, but to kill her is to pull the trigger on something much bigger than a marriage. When Catherine first came to England, she wasn't meant for Henry at all. She was sent to marry his older brother, Prince Arthur, the original Tudor heir. They married, he died, And immediately, Catherine's life became a legal question. Had the marriage been consummated? If it had, Henry, as Arthur's brother, was forbidden by biblical law to marry her, unless the Pope granted a special dispensation. Catherine swore the marriage had never been consummated. Her parents supported her. Rome agreed. The Pope granted the dispensation. It was more than a private reassurance. It was a formal, written, papal ruling, a document that reached from Rome into the heart of England and said, this union is permitted. Years later, Henry would use that very story as the foundation of his great matter, his attempt to divorce her. But Catherine never forgot how complicated the law around her marriage truly was. She knew from the beginning that her status was woven into a web of theology and international treaties, and she would use that web to trap her husband. For Catherine, the marriage was never just about love or duty. It was about legal standing, dynastic security, and the protection that came from being at the center of a diplomatic bargain. For nearly 24 years, Catherine was Henry's unquestioned queen. She ruled beside him. She served as regent while he was in France. She raised armies to repel Scottish invasion at Flodden, where her forces crushed and killed the Scottish king. She wrote to Henry, half in grief and half in triumph, offering to send him the dead king's coat for his war trophies. This was no passive, quiet wife. This was a queen trained from birth to be a ruler. She understood how to project strength, how to wrap ruthlessness in piety, how to be both devout and deadly when her kingdom required it. But there was one thing she could not give him, a living son. Their only surviving child was a daughter, Mary. Catherine adored her. Henry did not. He wanted a prince to secure his fragile dynasty. And when Anne Boleyn entered the stage, witty and young and dangerous, Henry found the perfect excuse to turn his anxiety into obsession. He convinced himself and tried to convince the world that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. It was a clever argument. It made Henry less like a man who wanted out of a marriage and more like a man desperately seeking forgiveness from heaven. It let him dress selfish desire in holy robes. It turned his midlife crisis into a theological crisis. But in trying to erase Catherine, Henry made a fatal mistake. He turned a domestic problem, a king and his wife, into an international legal case. And Catherine saw her opening. Henry's strategy was simple. Declare that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid. Argue that the papal dispensation allowing it had been against God's law. Use this sin to justify an annulment, freeing him to marry Anne Boleyn. The key to all of this was keeping the matter inside England. If he could convince local church courts and English bishops, he thought he could pressure Rome to ratify the decision later. He needed it to look like England had already decided, and the Pope was just stamping the paperwork. Catherine refused to play along. She did something radical. She rejected the idea that she was just Henry's subject. She insisted on being treated as a Spanish Infanta, a foreign royal with rights beyond English borders. She used Henry's own argument against him. If he claimed their marriage was invalid from the start, then she was not truly his wife under English law. And if she was not truly his wife, then she was also not truly his subject. Which meant one crucial thing. England had no right to decide her case alone. She had the right to appeal to Rome. In other words, Catherine of Aragon built herself a legal wall out of Henry's own reasoning. He said, "This marriage was a mistake." She replied, "Then you don't own me. And if you don't own me, you don't get to judge me. The Pope does." She took the loophole Henry was trying to squeeze through and turned it into a fortress door that slammed shut in his face. That move changed everything. Catherine's refusal to submit turned a domestic divorce into a full-blown international crisis. Suddenly, this wasn't just Henry versus Catherine. It was Henry versus the papacy. And behind the papacy loomed Charles V, Catherine's nephew, Holy Roman Emperor. Remember that name, because he's the quiet giant standing behind every decision Henry makes from this point on. Charles V wasn't just some distant cousin. He was a man who commanded armies across Europe, who had just sacked Rome in 1527, who held the Pope effectively hostage in his shadow. The Pope was not free. He was balancing two storms: Henry's demands on one side, Charles's power on the other. Imagine being Henry. On one side, you have Anne Boleyn whispering promises of sons and passion, demanding a crown. On the other hand, a wronged queen, backed by the most powerful military machine in Europe, appealed her case directly to a pope who owed his survival to her family. Could Henry really drag Catherine into a tower cell, accuse her of treason, chop off her head like he later did to Anne? What would Charles do if his aunt's blood stained English soil? Can you picture it? Ships gathering, imperial armies marching, England isolated while Catholic Europe roared in outrage. Henry could terrorize his own nobles. He could dismantle monasteries. He could bully bishops. But he could not afford to make Catherine of Aragon a martyr. Not politically, not legally, not military. She wasn't just a wife. She was a case, a legal and diplomatic bomb that could blow up his throne. And the fuse would have been her execution. As the trial dragged on, Catherine played her role to perfection. In 1529, at the famous Blackfriars trial, she walked into the court, knelt before Henry, and delivered one of the most devastating speeches ever given by a queen. She reminded him that she had come to him a virgin, that she had been a faithful wife, that she had carried his children at the risk of her life. Then she stood up, ignored the judges, and walked straight out of the courtroom, declaring that she did not recognize their authority. She appealed directly to Rome. In that instant, Catherine made it clear to the whole world. This wasn't a weak, weeping woman begging for scraps of affection. This was a queen demanding to be judged on the world stage. Henry could fume. He could insult her. He could strip her title and call her Princess Dowager of Wales. But he could not break the legal wall she built. As long as Catherine refused to accept English jurisdiction, as long as she claimed her rights as a Spanish royal and appealed to Rome, any attempt to imprison or kill her would not just be cruelty. It would be an international crime. And Henry's entire identity was built on the illusion that he was righteous and lawful. He wanted to be feared, but he also wanted to be right. Killing Catherine would have exposed the truth, that his great matter was never about God. It was about himself. Now compare that to Anne Boleyn. Anne had no empire behind her, no foreign crown, no emperor ready to mobilize armies. She had relatives at court and a faction of ambitious men, but she was still, in the eyes of Europe, a commoner elevated by scandal. When Henry decided he was tired of her, Cromwell could manufacture charges. Courts could be stacked, juries could be bullied, and the only people who might protest were English nobles already afraid for their own necks. No emperor, no foreign king, no pope whose hands were tied by her family. Anne was brilliant, dangerous, and alone. Catherine was isolated in England, but not alone in Europe. That is why Henry dared to kill Anne Boleyn and only dared to exile Catherine of Aragon. One was domestically inconvenient. The other was internationally explosive. One could be erased with ink and steel. The other would echo across the courts of Europe as a declaration of war. Henry did everything in his power to crush Catherine without actually spilling her blood. He banished her from court. He separated her from her daughter, Mary, breaking the heart of a mother whose entire identity was bound up in her child. He cut off her income, sifted her from one cold residence to another, tried to force her to call herself Princess Dowager instead of Queen. Every letter she wrote, every priest who visited her, every servant who dared call her Your Majesty was a small act of rebellion. And Catherine refused to yield. On the last day of her life, she signed her letters, Catherine the Queen. It was more than pride. It was legal insistence. If she was queen, her daughter Mary was legitimate. If she was queen, then Henry's marriage to Anne was adultery, not law. If she was queen, then Henry's entire religious revolution was built on a lie. She didn't need an army. Her weapon was status. Her battlefield was the law. And with each signature, with each stubborn refusal to let go of that title, she reminded Henry and the world that no act of parliament could rewrite the past. In January 1536, Catherine died at Kimbolton Castle, officially from illness. Some whispered about poison, but there is no clear proof. What we do know is this: Henry did not kill her. He let nature do the work. He wore yellow, the color of celebration in Spain, when he heard the news. He and Anne paraded in public, rejoicing that the problem was gone. But look at what happened next. Within months, Anne Boleyn herself was gone. Arrested, tried, executed. Why? Because once Catherine was dead, once that legal and diplomatic wall vanished, Anne was no longer the other woman. She became, in Henry's eyes, just another wife who failed to give him a living son. Catherine's death freed Henry from the need to be cautious. He no longer had to worry about infuriating the emperor over his aunt. He could turn inward again, back to the bloody game he played so well. And Anne, with no empire at her back and no legal shield in Rome, paid the price. In a grim way, Catherine's survival had protected Anne too, not by intention, but by the sheer weight of the danger her presence created. When that weight vanished, the axe moved. So what does all this mean for how we see Catherine of Aragon? She was not just a victim crushed by a cruel husband. She was a strategist who used every weapon available to a woman in her time. Her birth, her status, her faith, her motherhood, her understanding of international law. She made herself too expensive to kill, too dangerous to martyr, too entangled in foreign power to simply remove. Her resistance was not loud like Anne's. It was not flirtatious, not fiery, but slow, immovable, relentless, like a stone wall Henry could never quite break. And at the core of that resistance was something visceral and deeply human: her love for her daughter Mary. Catherine believed that if she accepted being anything less than queen, Mary would be downgraded to a bastard, cast aside forever. So she chose exile over compromise, loss over submission, suffering over safety. She chose to stand when kneeling would have spared her pain. In a world that rewarded obedience, she practiced a different kind of obedience. Obedience to her conscience, to her vows, to her God, not to the whims of a man who had broken his. In the end, Catherine died far from court, but she died as she had lived, a queen in her own mind and in the eyes of millions of Catholics across Europe. Her last letter to Henry called him "my most dear lord and husband," forgave him, and begged him to be a good father to Mary. Even in that final act, she held the moral high ground in a way Henry never could. He had destroyed his marriage to her on paper. She had preserved it in history. And history, in the end, chose her side. The church that he broke, the empire that backed her, the daughter who would one day wear the crown, all of them testified that Catherine had never truly been unseated. So when we ask, why did Henry dare to kill Anne Boleyn, but never dare to harm Catherine of Aragon, the answer is not simple sentiment. It is because Catherine of Aragon was protected by three things Henry could not defeat: A bloodline that tied her to the most powerful man in Europe. A legal argument that put her case in Rome's hands, not his. And a moral authority that made her a living rebuke to his conscience. To kill Anne was brutal. To kill Catherine would have been catastrophic. That is the wall that stood between Henry and the woman he once claimed to love. A wall of law, of politics, of faith, built quietly by Catherine herself. It was invisible to the eyes of those who only saw kings and crowns, but it was real enough that Henry, for all his ego, never dared to break it. So what do you think? Was Catherine of Aragon truly helpless, or was she the only one who ever managed to corner Henry VIII without lifting a sword? Did Henry secretly fear her to the end, or did he convince himself that God was still on his side? We will never know exactly what kept him awake at night, but we do know this. In a world where queens could fall in a single week, Catherine of Aragon made herself unexecutable, a legal wall, a political bomb, a mother who refused to let her name and her daughter be erased. If this story changed the way you see Henry, Catherine, and Anne, tell me in the comments. Whose strategy impressed you more? Anne's boldness or Catherine's quiet, unbreakable wall? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Hidden Crowns. Because this is only one of the many hidden stories behind the glitter of royal crowns. And next time, we'll peel back another layer of the lies history told us about the Tudors.